He stood near the tall glass windows of the ballroom watching the city lights shimmer below, while soft music floated through the air, and servers moved quietly between guests carrying silver trays filled with drinks and expensive smiles. And this night had been planned with care, because it was meant to remind everyone of who he was, and what he owned, and how easily power followed him into every room. His name was Daniel Rothman, and he had built his fortune from real estate deals that crushed weaker competitors and rewarded his patience and confidence. And by the age of 40, he was known not just for his wealth, but for his presence, which carried an unspoken command that made people listen before he spoke and agree before he finished speaking. The party was held in one of the most exclusive private venues in the city, a place where marble floors reflected the glow of chandeliers, and every detail whispered luxury, from the gold-trimmed walls to the white grand piano resting near the center of the hall like a quiet promise waiting to be touched. Guests arrived dressed in tailored suits and elegant gowns, laughing easily with one another, their conversations floating between business deals, vacations, and subtle comparisons of success and status. And for them, this party was another night of comfort and belonging. Among the staff moving through the room was a young waitress named Elina, who wore a simple black uniform and carried herself with quiet professionalism, her steps careful, her posture straight, and her eyes observant but reserved. Elina had been working events like this for years, not because she enjoyed the environment, but because it paid enough to support her mother and younger brother. And she had learned early that blending into the background was often safer than being noticed. She moved between tables, refilling glasses and collecting empty plates, listening to fragments of conversations that reminded her how distant this world was from her own. And yet she never allowed bitterness to show on her face, because she believed dignity did not require an audience. As she passed near the piano, she slowed for just a moment, not because anyone called her, but because her eyes were drawn to it almost against her will. And for a brief second, memories stirred inside her, memories of a small apartment, an old upright piano with chipped keys, and a father who used to sit beside her, guiding her hands gently across the notes. That life felt far away now, tucked behind long work hours, unpaid bills, and responsibilities that left little room for dreams. And she pushed the thought aside quickly, reminding herself that she was here to work, not to remember. Daniel noticed her at that moment, though not for the reasons that mattered, and his attention landed on her like it did on many things he considered beneath him, with curiosity mixed with amusement. He watched as she paused near the piano, and in his mind, he formed a story that fit his view of the world, a story where people stayed in their place, and those who stepped outside it did so for the entertainment of others. He turned to a small group of guests near him, investors, old friends, and acquaintances who thrived on his approval, and he smiled in a way that suggested something interesting was about to happen. He asked casually who the staff manager was, and when the man stepped forward, Daniel spoke loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, saying that the night needed something memorable, something fun to lighten the mood. The manager nodded quickly, eager to please, and Daniel let his gaze drift toward Elina again, and he said that the waitress standing near the piano looked like she had been admiring it, and perhaps she would like to play something for them. Laughter rippled through the group, not cruel but dismissive, the kind of laughter that assumes the joke needs no explanation, because everyone understands the hierarchy it rests on. The manager hesitated just briefly before gesturing for Elina to come closer, and she felt a tightening in her chest as she approached, unsure of what she had done wrong or what was expected of her. Daniel looked at her directly now, his eyes sharp, assessing, and he asked her in a tone that sounded polite but carried an edge whether she knew how to play the piano. Elina felt the room close in on her, though nothing had physically changed, and she became aware of the guests watching, the way their expressions shifted between curiosity, amusement, and indifference. She answered honestly, saying yes quietly, that she had learned when she was younger, but she had not played in a long time. The honesty seemed to please him more than denial would have, and he smiled wider, and said that this was perfect, that everyone would enjoy a little music from someone unexpected. The manager looked uncomfortable, but said nothing, and Elina realized that refusing might cost her the job she needed so desperately, and the weight of that reality pressed against her ribs, making it hard to breathe. She glanced at the piano again, this time not with nostalgia, but with fear, because the memory of joy attached to it felt fragile here, exposed under the gaze of people who did not see her as a person. Daniel raised his glass slightly and announced to the surrounding guests that the waitress would play the piano for them as part of the evening entertainment, and the room responded with applause that felt more like approval of the idea than support for her. Elina walked toward the piano, feeling each step echo inside her body, and as she sat down on the bench, she could feel her hands trembling slightly despite her effort to steady them. She placed her fingers on the keys without pressing them, and for a moment she stared down at the smooth white surface, trying to gather herself while whispers and quiet laughs floated around her. Daniel leaned back satisfied, already imagining the awkward performance. He expected the kind that would reinforce the unspoken rules of who belonged where. He believed the moment would serve as harmless amusement, a reminder that talent without status meant little in a room like this, and that power included the right to turn people into moments. Elina closed her eyes briefly, not to escape but to center herself, and in that darkness she remembered her father telling her that music was not about perfection, but about honesty, about letting the truth of what you feel move through your hands. She took a slow breath and prepared to play, not knowing yet that this night would become something far larger than humiliation or performance, but feeling that whatever happened she would not abandon herself in front of them. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content. Without them she sat still for a moment with her hands resting lightly above the keys, while the noise of the party continued behind her glasses, clinking, soft laughter, low conversations, and the subtle hum of a room full of people who believed they were in control of the moment. Her fingers felt stiff at first, not from lack of memory, but from the weight of attention pressing down on her shoulders, and she reminded herself that fear was natural and that it did not mean weakness. The piano in front of her was far more expensive than any she had ever touched, its surface smooth and polished, its keys perfectly aligned, responding to the slightest pressure. And for a brief instant she felt unworthy of it, but then she corrected that thought, because music had never belonged to wealth. She inhaled slowly and placed her hands more firmly on the keys, letting her posture straighten, not as an act of defiance, but as a return to something familiar, something true. The first notes she played were soft, almost tentative, like a conversation beginning quietly between old friends, and a few guests turned their heads, slightly surprised, not by brilliance, but by the calm steadiness of the sound. Daniel noticed this shift, though he did not yet understand it, and he leaned forward just a little, expecting the moment to collapse into awkwardness. Yet instead the melody continued, steady, controlled, and sincere. Elina chose a piece she had not played in years, but one that lived deep within her memory, a composition her father loved, because it carried both sadness and hope woven together. And as she played, her fingers began to move more freely, guided by instinct rather than thought. The room slowly changed, though no one announced it. Conversations faded one by one, replaced by a growing attention drawn toward the piano, and the laughter that had once hovered easily now felt out of place. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they were meant to listen or continue their conversations, but the music made that decision for them, filling the space with an emotional presence that demanded respect without asking for it. Daniel felt something unfamiliar stir within him, irritation perhaps, because the moment was not unfolding as he had planned, or perhaps because he sensed control slipping from his grasp in a way he could not easily explain. He glanced around and noticed the expressions on his guests' faces. Some looked surprised, others thoughtful. A few even moved closer to the piano, drawn in despite themselves. Elina no longer saw them, though her eyes remained open. She was focused entirely on the movement of her hands and the sound they created. And with each passing measure her confidence grew, not as performance but as release. Memories surfaced as she played, memories of practicing late at night, after finishing homework, of her father clapping softly, so as not to disturb neighbors, of her mother listening from the kitchen with quiet pride. Those memories flowed into the music, giving it warmth and depth, and though the guests did not know the source, they felt the emotion carried within the notes. A woman in an elegant blue dress wiped her eyes, subtly surprised by her own reaction, while a man near the back lowered his phone, having intended to record the moment for humor, but finding himself unable to treat it lightly. The staff members paused in their work, standing still near the walls, watching with expressions of disbelief and admiration, because they knew Elina only as a quiet coworker, someone who spoke little and kept to herself. Daniel tightened his grip on his glass and took a slow sip, his smile gone, replaced by a thoughtful frown. And for the first time that night he looked at Elina not as an object of amusement, but as a presence commanding the room. The music swelled slightly, growing stronger, more confident, yet never aggressive, and the piano seemed to respond eagerly, as though relieved to finally be used for something honest. Elina felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, but she did not stop them. She allowed the emotion to move through her fingers, believing now fully in what her father had taught her, that music was truth without explanation. When the final notes of the piece approached, the room was completely silent, not a single voice, not a single clink of glass, and the air felt heavy with shared feeling. She slowed her hands, deliberately letting the ending unfold naturally without rush, and when the final note faded, she lifted her fingers gently from the keys and sat still once again. For a heartbeat nothing happened, and then the applause began, not hesitant, not polite, but full and genuine, rising from every corner of the room. People stood, some clapped with awe, others with respect, a few with expressions that suggested they had just been reminded of something important they had long forgotten. Elina turned slightly on the bench looking out at the crowd, her face flushed, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady her breath. And she saw not judgment now but admiration, confusion, and even gratitude. Daniel stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and the room quieted again, sensing that his reaction mattered more than it should have. He looked at her for a long moment, longer than was comfortable, and then he nodded once, not in praise but in acknowledgement, and said that he had not expected that. The words were simple, but they carried weight, and Elina understood that while he would never apologize, the shift in tone was significant. The manager hurried forward, asking softly if Elina was all right, his voice filled with concern and pride, and she nodded, standing carefully, her legs slightly unsteady. Guests approached her one by one, offering compliments, asking where she had learned to play, telling her she was extraordinary. And she accepted their words politely, though she felt detached, as though the moment belonged to something larger than herself. Daniel watched all of this from a distance, his expression unreadable, and for the first time in years, he questioned the ease with which he had used his power. He told himself it was nothing, just an unexpected talent, but the discomfort lingered, refusing to fade. Elina returned to her duties eventually, but everything felt different now. Every step, every glance, every whispered comment carried new meaning. She knew this night would not end when the party did, and that whatever followed would challenge her in ways she could not yet see. As the music resumed softly through speakers, and the party tried to reclaim its rhythm, an invisible line had been crossed, and none of them fully understood its consequences yet. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content. Without them, the night did not return to what it had been before, even though music played again, and guests tried to resume their conversations, because something subtle yet powerful had shifted, and that shift followed Elina as she moved through the room carrying empty glasses and offering polite smiles. People who had barely noticed her earlier now looked at her differently, some with curiosity, some with admiration, and some with quiet embarrassment. And she felt their eyes in a way she never had before, not as someone invisible, but as someone suddenly placed under a different light. She kept her focus on her work, reminding herself that attention was temporary, and that once the party ended, everything would return to normal, or at least that was what she hoped. Daniel, however, could not shake the feeling that had settled inside him, and as he spoke with his guests, his mind kept drifting back to the image of Elina at the piano, composed, honest, and unafraid in a way that challenged his assumptions. He had spent his life believing that confidence came from power and money, yet what he had seen did not fit that belief, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As the night wore on, several guests approached him, commenting on the performance, some praising his idea, others admitting they were deeply moved, and he responded with controlled smiles. But inside he felt exposed, as though his intentions had been quietly revealed without anyone saying them aloud. Elina finished her shift later that night, changing into her worn jacket in the staff room, and sitting for a moment on the bench to breathe, because the weight of the evening finally caught up to her. Her hands still felt warm, as if the keys were still beneath her fingers, and she wondered whether her father would have been proud, knowing that thought would stay with her long after she left the building. When she stepped outside, the cold air grounded her, and the city looked the same as always, loud, restless, and indifferent, and yet she felt different walking through it. The following morning she returned to her routine, waking early, taking the bus across town, and preparing for another day of work, expecting the memory of the night to fade into something distant. Instead, she found herself called into the manager's office, where he spoke carefully, telling her that several guests had asked about her background, and that one in particular had requested to meet her again. She already knew who that was, and her stomach tightened, because she did not know what to expect, and uncertainty felt heavier than fear. Later that day, Daniel sat alone in his office, overlooking the city, the same city he had admired from the ballroom, and he replayed the moment again and again, trying to understand why it lingered. He told himself that reaching out was simply curiosity, or perhaps an attempt to resolve his discomfort, yet part of him recognized that he wanted to hear her story, not to control it, but to understand it. When Elina was told that Daniel wished to speak with her privately, she considered refusing, but something inside her urged her to face whatever came next, believing that avoiding it would give the night power over her. They met in a quiet lounge far removed from the noise and spectacle of the party, and for the first time they sat across from each other as equals in silence. Daniel spoke first, not with authority, but with hesitation, saying that he had underestimated her, and that what she played had stayed with him longer than he expected. Elina listened carefully, choosing her words with care, and she told him simply that music was something she carried with her, and that playing it was not about proving anything to anyone. The conversation was brief but honest, and when it ended, both of them walked away changed, though neither fully understood how yet. Elina returned home that evening feeling a mix of relief and uncertainty, knowing that something had begun even if she did not yet know its shape. Daniel remained behind watching the city once more, realizing that power did not always speak the loudest, and that sometimes it listened. Neither of them knew where the path ahead would lead, but both understood that the story was no longer about a single night or a single performance. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. The days that followed moved slowly for Elina, yet each hour felt charged with a quiet tension, as if life itself was waiting to see what she would do next. And she returned to her routine with disciplined working shifts, attending to guests, and keeping her focus steady. But the memory of the piano followed her like a low melody that never fully faded. At home, her mother noticed the change not because Elina spoke of it, but because she moved differently, pausing more often, looking thoughtful, sometimes smiling without realizing it. And when her mother asked gently, Elina shared only that she had played again after a long time and that it had stirred something she thought she had buried. Her mother listened without interruption, nodding with the kind of understanding that came from years of watching dreams set aside for survival. And she told Elina that some things wait patiently for us even when we stop believing in them. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself distracted in ways that unsettled him more than any financial risk ever had. And during meetings, his attention drifted, and numbers that once excited him now felt hollow compared to the memory of sound and emotion that had filled the ballroom. He began to notice the people around him, more the assistants who spoke only when spoken to, the servers who entered rooms silently, and he wondered how many lives he had passed through without ever seeing them. One afternoon, he requested a background check on Elina, not for leverage as he once might have done, but out of curiosity. And what he learned surprised him, not because her life was dramatic, but because it was ordinary, marked by sacrifice, responsibility, and quiet resilience. She had studied music briefly as a child through a community program until funding was cut and life demanded practicality. And she had worked consistently since her teenage years, never missing a shift, never asking for special treatment. This information did not make him feel powerful. Instead, it made him reflective, and he began to question the structures he had benefited from without challenge. Elina was invited to play again, not at a party, but in a small private setting for a charity event Daniel supported, and she hesitated, fearing that the invitation carried hidden expectations, but the tone was different, respectful, careful, and she agreed on the condition that it remained simple. When the evening came, the audience was smaller and quieter, and she felt less exposed yet more vulnerable because this time she chose to be there. She played with the same honesty as before, not seeking approval, and when the applause came, it felt warmer, less complicated, and she realized that music did not belong to moments of humiliation or praise, but to connection. Daniel watched from the back, feeling something loosen inside him, and he understood that change did not come from grand gestures, but from sustained awareness and choice. After the event, he thanked her without condescension, and asked if she had ever considered teaching or performing again. And for the first time, Elina allowed herself to answer honestly, saying that she had, but fear and responsibility had kept her grounded. He did not offer solutions, only encouragement, and that restraint mattered more than anything else he could have done. Weeks passed, and Elina enrolled in evening classes, slowly balancing work and study, and each step forward felt earned, not gifted, and that distinction gave her strength. Daniel began redirecting funds toward community arts programs anonymously, not seeking recognition, but seeking balance. And while he never spoke publicly of the night, it remained a private turning point. Their lives continued separately, yet connected by a shared understanding that power could wound or uplift, and that choice defined character. Elina played often now, sometimes for small audiences, sometimes alone, and each time she touched the keys, she remembered the night not with pain but with clarity. She had not been saved by talent, nor had Daniel been redeemed by generosity, but both had been altered by a moment of truth that neither could undo. The world around them remained imperfect and unequal, but within their own spheres something had shifted quietly, permanently, and that was enough to begin. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. Ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. Life began to test Elina in quieter ways after the initial excitement faded, and the applause became memory rather than sound. And she found that growth did not arrive as a single transformation, but as daily decisions that required patience and courage. She balanced long shifts at work with evening classes, and the exhaustion was real yet different from before because it carried purpose. And when she sat on the bus late at night with tired eyes and aching hands, she felt something close to pride. Her classmates came from different backgrounds, some younger, some older, and many were surprised to learn that she worked full-time while studying, and even more surprised when they heard her play during practice sessions. She did not speak much about the night of the party because she did not want her story shaped by humiliation or rescue, and she wanted her progress to belong to her alone. At work, some colleagues treated her with newfound respect, while others grew distant, unsure how to relate to someone who had briefly stood in the spotlight. and she navigated these changes with quiet grace, choosing kindness over resentment. The management offered her more visible roles at events, and she accepted, selectively learning to set boundaries and to recognize when opportunity came with strings attached. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to wrestle with internal shifts that had begun without permission, and he noticed how often he paused now before speaking, especially with people whose lives were far removed from his own. He found himself listening more and talking less, and though this change confused some of his peers, it brought him a sense of grounding he had not known before. He attended more community events, anonymously sitting in the back watching children perform music with uneven confidence and genuine joy. And each performance reminded him of the night that had disrupted his certainty. He began to mentor young entrepreneurs from modest backgrounds, not as benefactor, but as guide, sharing mistakes as much as success and learning in return. Elina and Daniel crossed paths only occasionally, and when they did, their interactions were simple, respectful, and brief, acknowledging a shared history without allowing it to define them. One afternoon, Elina received news that her mother had fallen ill, and the fragile balance she had built was threatened by fear and responsibility. She took time off from classes and worked to care for her family, and the weight of old worries returned, pressing against her chest and testing her resolve. Music became her refuge once again, and late at night, she played softly in her small apartment, letting emotion move freely through her hands and reminding herself that strength could coexist with vulnerability. Daniel learned of her situation indirectly and struggled with whether to intervene, knowing that help could empower or overshadow. And he chose restraint, offering support through a third party without revealing his involvement. Elina accepted the assistance with gratitude, unaware of its source, and used it wisely, stabilizing her family situation while maintaining her independence. As her mother recovered, Elina returned to her studies with renewed determination, understanding that progress was rarely linear and that setbacks did not erase growth. She performed at a small recital organized by her school, and the audience included neighbors, classmates, and a few strangers, and the applause she received felt honest and earned. In that moment, she realized that fulfillment did not come from proving others wrong, but from honoring herself consistently. Daniel watched a recording of the recital sent to him by a mutual contact, and felt a quiet satisfaction, not in having influenced her path, but in having chosen not to control it. Their lives continued forward, shaped by choices rather than spectacle, and though the world around them remained imperfect, they carried forward a lesson that would guide them through future challenges. Both understood now that dignity could be reclaimed and power could be redefined, and that true change often moved without announcement. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content. Without them, time continued its steady movement, and with it came moments that tested the quiet strength Elina had been building piece by piece, and the world did not pause to acknowledge her growth, nor did it soften its demands simply because she was trying. Her days became carefully structured. Mornings began early with preparing breakfast for her family, then traveling across the city to work, followed by classes or practice sessions, and nights ended late with reflection and fatigue settling deep into her bones. There were days when doubt returned without warning, whispering that she was reaching beyond what was realistic, and that stability was safer than aspiration. Yet each time she sat at the piano, those thoughts loosened their grip. Music had become more than expression. It was now discipline, responsibility, and choice. And she learned that loving something did not mean it was easy. It meant it was worth returning to, even when it demanded more than comfort. At her workplace, the novelty of her story faded, and life resumed its familiar rhythm, which she welcomed, because it allowed her to be seen not as an exception, but as a person doing her job. Some guests still recognized her and asked questions, and she answered politely without inviting deeper discussion, because she did not want her identity tied to a single moment. Her instructors noticed her commitment and encouraged her to consider advanced opportunities, including auditions for local ensembles and small performance grants, and each suggestion brought both excitement and fear. Elina took time to consider each option, weighing ambition against responsibility, and she learned that saying no was sometimes as important as saying yes. Meanwhile, Daniel faced changes of his own that unfolded quietly but persistently, and he found that once his perspective shifted, it could not return to what it had been. He noticed how often people deferred to him out of habit rather than agreement, and he began inviting disagreement into conversations, challenging his teams to speak honestly even when it was uncomfortable. This approach slowed decisions and frustrated some colleagues, but it also revealed blind spots that had long gone unchallenged. He began reading more literature, philosophy, and biographies of people who had shaped change without wealth or dominance, and these stories resonated with him more deeply than he expected. At home, his evenings grew quieter and more reflective, and he found that silence no longer felt empty but necessary. He thought often about accountability and how power without awareness could erode character, and this awareness became a quiet compass guiding his choices. Months passed and Elina was invited to perform at a modest community fundraiser, an event meant to support after-school arts programs, and she accepted because the cause aligned with her own story. The performance space was simple, a small hall with folding chairs and uneven lighting, yet the atmosphere felt sincere and welcoming. She played with confidence shaped by experience rather than applause, and when she finished the response was heartfelt and warm. Among the audience were children watching closely, some with curiosity, some with awe, and after the event, a young girl approached her asking how long it took to learn. Elina knelt to the child's level and answered honestly, saying that learning never really ended and that patience mattered more than talent. That interaction stayed with her long after the evening ended, and she realized that influence did not require recognition, it required presence. Daniel supported the fundraiser, quietly ensuring the program received ongoing funding without attaching his name, and this anonymity brought him a sense of alignment he had long been missing. He understood now that meaningful contribution did not need witnesses. As seasons changed, both Elina and Daniel faced moments of fatigue and uncertainty, and neither was immune to frustration or doubt. Elina struggled during a demanding semester when financial pressure tightened and free time disappeared, and she questioned whether balance was sustainable. Daniel encountered resistance from peers who viewed his evolving values as weakness, and he faced criticism that challenged his confidence. Yet both drew from the same source of learning that had begun on an unexpected night and carried forward in different ways. They understood that integrity required consistency, and that change was not proven in moments of clarity but in sustained behavior. When they crossed paths again at a small cultural event, there was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of the past, only a brief exchange of recognition and mutual respect. They did not speak of what had been because it no longer needed explanation. Life continued unfolding, complex, imperfect, and demanding, and within it, both moved forward, shaped not by humiliation or redemption, but by choice, awareness, and responsibility. They were no longer defined by a single evening, but by the many quiet decisions that followed it. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content. Without them, the final stage of the journey did not arrive with applause or recognition, but with a sense of quiet alignment that settled into both of their lives and stayed there. Elina completed the program with steady commitment, and when it ended, she did not feel the need to rush toward anything grand, because she had learned that direction mattered more than speed. She accepted a role that allowed her to teach part-time, perform occasionally, and remain close to her family, and this balance gave her room to breathe and to grow without losing herself. Her mother regained strength, and her brother began pursuing his own education, inspired not by success, but by consistency, and Elina understood that example often spoke louder than advice. Music remained central to her life, but it no longer defined her worth. It was a language she chose to speak rather than a test she had to pass. She played for audiences small and large, and sometimes only for herself, and each time the act felt complete without needing validation. Daniel reached a point where his work reflected his values more closely than ever before, and while his name still carried influence, he no longer relied on it to feel secure. He accepted that some relationships would fade as priorities shifted, and he allowed that loss without resentment. He continued supporting initiatives quietly, and when asked about changes in his approach, he spoke honestly about learning to listen and to pause. The memory of the night that brought Elina into his awareness no longer carried guilt or pride. It had become simply a reminder of how easily power could misjudge, and how deeply humility could reshape perspective. Years later, at a small public event celebrating community arts, Elina performed a short piece, and Daniel attended without expectation, sitting among others without distinction. They exchanged a brief greeting and nothing more, and there was no need for conversation because their shared history no longer required explanation. Each had moved forward carrying lessons rather than labels, and neither sought closure, because growth had already provided it. The audience applauded warmly, and Elina bowed, gently acknowledging the moment, and then stepped away, knowing that fulfillment did not linger in sound but in purpose. Daniel left the event early, walking through the city with a sense of calm that once felt unfamiliar and now felt earned. Their lives continued on separate paths, intersecting only in memory and influence, and both understood that true change often unfolded quietly, shaped by daily choices rather than defining moments. What began as an act meant to diminish had instead revealed the enduring strength of dignity, awareness, and restraint. And in that understanding, the story found its natural end, not in triumph or regret, but in balance, honesty, and quiet resolve.